Okay, we are going to start. Since it is, well, actually, we are 1 minute over, but uh, anyways. Hello, everyone. My name is Quinn. I'm an 11th grade student at North Creek High, and I'm the speaker today for the lecture. My friend Edward here is a 12th grade. Edward, can you say hi?
Hello everyone. I will be just answering your guys' questions in the chat. So if you guys have anything, just put it in there and I'll answer it for you guys.
Hmm. Okay. Thank you all for joining our lecture. Before we start, let's go over some class rules. Please do not disrupt the class. We do have, power to mute everyone, but if it continues, we will have to kick people out. But I hope that won't happen. I trust that won't happen. It's best to take notes while following the lecture, but you probably don't need to write everything down. The recording will also be shared, so you can always look at that after. If you have any questions, you can ask in the chat box, and Edward will answer. If any questions are not fully answered, you can continue asking in the group chat and we will reply when we are available. Okay, let's begin. First, we will look over the key topics for the exam. I believe that you guys all know about this after a year. I think you guys should have gone over most of these. As you can see, the most important, well, most highly weighted parts are units 3 through 6, and you can see on the far right side about the percentage they are weighted on the exam. So this also means that this will be the most important part and also have the most exam questions. So that part might be an area of focus to look at. These are some of the big ideas in each unit. Um, these different topics, these big ideas are often stuff that they would ask you on things like the FRQs. So when they are speaking about these, it's important to remember which are the most important. You guys can always come back and look at this afterwards. So there isn't much to talk about here, so I'm just going to move on. These are the main ideas in each unit. Once again, I think you can find this on AP Classroom or something like that, but just the overview. Um, Yeah, so this is units 1 through 5. Once again, not much. We will go into detail for most of the important stuff as we move on through the timeline. I'll just leave this on for a brief moment. You guys can always come back to look at it. Okay, this is units 6 through 9. So you can see that unit 9, globalization, even though it seems like it has a lot more topics than other things, it's actually I would say from my experience, it's actually weighted far less than the other um, parts, despite them saying that it's also 8 to 10%. It's, I think, mostly because it's very recent, so uh, they don't have a lot to make big questions out of. So when they talk about this time period, the 1900s to the present, they would mostly talk about, I would say, units 7 and 8. Unit 9, mm, especially for FRQs, I don't believe they would put a lot of it there. Anyways, now that we're done with that, we shall begin from the start. The first major thing that you definitely need to remember for the entire exam is the Silk Road. So, um, yeah, just to make sure you guys understand, which of these lines, which colored line is the Silk Road? Can you guys answer that in chat? Is the Silk Road? Which one? Okay. Okay, good job, guys. Um, it's so the Silk Road, of course, I'm sure you guys would know is spans across the entirety of Asia and it connects like Europe, Asia, Middle East, and just facilitates trade in the early days. It was very active from all the way starting from the second century BC all the way till the mid 15th century. It's over about 6,400 kilometers, or if you would rather prefer in the 4,000 miles. It was It played a central role in facilitating economic, cultural, political, and religious interactions between these two sides. It's also known commonly as the first global trade route in history, and it had a scope way more important than just exchanging goods because besides like facilitating the economic trade, what else do you guys know that trade routes like the Silk Road could spread? Religion, yes. Culture, mm. Ideas, innovation, right? A bunch of technology could be spread. You guys know where gunpowder was invented? Where was the use of gunpowder invented? Right. And China, right? And then do you guys also know about the gunpowder empires that we will shortly talk about? Mm. Yeah, the gunpowder empires, they are more to the west side. So yeah, the facilitation of trade could help with these progress. So the Silk Road, you just need to remember that it exchanged stuff like arts, religion, cultures, ideas, and technology. It was a very major thing in trade. If you see anything about trade in the 1200s or 1300s, 1400s, you can think about the Silk Road. Now, the Silk Road did eventually end. Um, does anyone know the reason for that? Hmm. Well, that's partially true, right? So the Mongols did, we are going to talk about the Mongolian Empire, which is very important, but the Mongolians actually facilitated trade through the Silk Road because of the Pax Mongolica. Do you guys know what that is? The Pax Mongolica. Basically they protected the traders, right? So before the Silk Road was actually pretty not peaceful. They had to go through here. There were a bunch of warring nations. Those nations, of course, isn't like they're not important to the exam, but that's a context you need to know. If you want to write an essay about this, you can talk about that. Um, when the Mongols took over basically the entirety of Asia and even ventured into Europe, they basically vanquished all the kingdoms that were having war, so they brought like an era of peace in their kingdom, right? So like the Mongols actually promoted the trade. So I also saw people talking about the Black Death. The Black Death was also, we will also talk about that soon. It was spread to Europe um, through the Silk Road. However, in the end, the Silk Road ended was because of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire around the Middle East over there sort of just blocked it off and didn't accept further trade. So it was at that time, in the 15th century, where we see a shift from land-based trade into oceanic trade. And you might know a few names like Zheng He and Columbus. Yeah, that was like key figures of oceanic trade. Anyway, the Silk Road is just one of the major early trade routes. There's also the Trans-Saharan trade routes. This one is, I would say, I would definitely say it's less impactful than the Silk Road because the Silk Road is just very much impactful. However, this one spanned across the Sahara Desert, as you can assume from its name. It was basically the network of trade routes that connected Africa. It connected the Mediterranean coast to the West African savanna and sub-Saharan region. These routes were an important part of the global trade network and played a very significant role in the economic, cultural, and political development of Africa. So, as you can see in the chart, they were mostly used to transport a variety of goods, including valuable ones like gold, ivory, salt, and slaves. Traders also brought goods, ideas, and technologies from one part of the world to another, like you do with trade routes. Now, um, yeah, so you might know a key person in this era, also who benefited off of this trade, Mensa Musa. Do you guys know who that is? Yeah, he was very rich. I think he was said to be the richest person of history. He has a lot of gold. I once saw a picture of him. I don't know if it's like someone made a picture of him. It looked kind of like LeBron. Anyways, getting off topic. The Trans-Saharan trade routes were used by numerous people, including the ancient Romans. Um, the Arab empires of the Middle Ages, they used that as well. European colonial powers later on. And even though there were more modern transportation systems developed, they continued to be important, the trade routes. So overall, this trade network led to the formation of more diasporic communities, new technologies, and the spread of religion. And of course, Mansa Musa's richness. Okay, we have one more trade route that's super important in this era. So we talked about the Silk Road and the Trans-Saharan trade routes. Which other one was also very prevalent in this era? It's a more naval-based one, right? The next one is the Indian Ocean trade. I think we had a little bit of a preview over here in the picture of the Silk Road. It's the Indian Ocean trade. So this one, you would go around the coast, right? You can see by the lines, they would hug the coast. Of course, like no one really needs to go out to the sea. Hugging the coast, going along these like ports and trading. So the Indian Ocean trade has been a key factor in East-West exchanges throughout history, right? They can long distance trade made it a very dynamic zone of interaction between these people. Do you guys know what DAOs are? Right, I mean, I would say that's a pretty good vocab word to remember. DAOs, it's a form of ships, and like they made a bunch of technology to which will later like yeah, it will later progress, and the technologies in this era, I would say, contributed to the rise of maritime trade. Anyways, the Indian Ocean trade, I would say it's slightly less like they won't talk about as much as the Silk Road or the Saharan Desert, but I think it is something you need to know. Um, there were many cities founded, of course, along this coast due to the trade, as trading and economics work. Okay, next is something that we talked about right before, the Mongolian Empire. So the Mongol Empire is the largest land-based empire in history. The leader was Genghis Khan, who's I think many history problems would debate if Genghis Khan had an overall good impact or bad impact on the places he conquered. I think that's a very popular FRQ thing on the test because people would say that the places he conquered would later become um more prosperous. Some people also say that he committed genocide and he killed a lot of people and was very cruel in his conquest. But anyway, that's something that might show up on your DBQ, I think. Anyway, um, you can see on this map, the entire area is all of the Mongol Empire. So that's a large part. I think you can see like many of the nations of now. He took over the entirety of China, Mongolia, and bits of Europe, the Middle East, and etc. So the Pax Mongolica, like said before, it basically um, it brought about peace within the Mongol Empire. Of course, they kept conquering, right? But this piece within the Mongol Empire, as you can see, if we remember, okay, I'll have you guys try to remember how much area this red part has covered, all right? And we're gonna go back to the Silk Road picture. Okay, a bit of Europe, and then we cut across all the way to the eastern coast. And now if we go back, you can see that the lines that the Silk Road mapped out are basically like covered, right? They're covered by the Mongol Empire. So, like said before, this means that the um, the trade would go on much easier because before, once again, there were warring nations that would cause the traders to possibly lose out on their trade and it's just dangerous to go. But now since the Pax Mongolica was there, it facilitated trade. Oh, they also started paper money, which it didn't work out that well, but it was like the start of it. And they also had like little passports, I think, like trading tickets. Anyway, that's not like a huge important thing, but the main thing you need to know is the Pax Mongolica facilitates trade along the Silk Road. Later, after Genghis Khan's after he, stopped living, the whole Mongolian Empire, of course, like broke off into parts. So can you guys like name a few khanates of the Mongol Empire? Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Anyways, the Mongol Empire and the later power is sort of like declined due to a bunch of rebellions. And the thing about the Mongols, this is just more like a fun fact rather than like something you need to really know, is that they are like a nomadic people, right? They aren't exactly like um an empire like the Chinese dynasties or like a monarchy like the European nations. So I would believe that it was pretty difficult to manage all of this place. So eventually they did sort of decline. So the Mongol Empire thrived between like around like the 13th century? Yeah, 13th century. And then they declined soon after. However, they did leave impact, right? They largest land-based empire in history, right? Yeah. Anyway, the next part we also, I think, talked about this a bit before, the Black Death. So the Black Death, very big pandemic, one of the most deadly ones. Everybody knows about it. It was a pandemic in Europe from 1346 to 1353. You don't need to remember this exact time. You just need to know mid 1300s, Black Death, Europe, not good. It was one of the most fatal pandemics in human history, as many as like 50 million people perished. Um, some sources say it was about 50% of their population, right? That's a lot of people dead. Um, this was spread through the Silk Road. The diseases spread over here. And you can see that often diseases do get spread through trade or like commerce, right? For example, what's another can I'm thinking of a certain trade or exchange, as you might call it, that also brought a bunch of disease to one of the sites. Can you guys think of what I was thinking about? Mm, good job, guys. Columbian exchange, right? What did the Columbian exchange bring? Smallpox, right? And Native Americans. So yeah, in the end, trade isn't just bringing goods or resources. You also bring ideas, you bring religion, you bring technologies, you bring arts. But in the end, it's not all good things, right? You also bring diseases, whether you like it or not. So that's why it's just not trade always brings many things. Anyway, the Black Death, there definitely won't be an FRQ completely centered around it because it's just like, for example, like I don't know if your history teacher has said this about I think it was Unit 7. Unit 7 was global conflict, World War One, World War Two. You guys wouldn't like have an FAQ about like how the war was fought and like what tactics were used, you wouldn't talk about the Black Death and like, oh, how many people died? Oh, how well was it exactly caused by? Oh, which doctors were trying to solve it? Because this is more so used more like a context, right? You might use this as like maybe outside evidence for something. You definitely need to remember it, but I wouldn't say it's one thing that they would like put an FAQ about it. Anyways, let's move on to the next one. So the Crusades. The Crusades. Um, Once again, I think this one would be mostly talked about for like religious conflict, right? Religious conflict occurs all around, like the Safavid and the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal empires, like but different like Muslims, they would fight, and then there's also the Crusades. This is technically a bit before the scope of before the scope of AP World History because AP World History technically starts in the 1200s and Crusades have started like way before, but this is also something to remember. Basically, we're just going to go over this really quickly. A series of religious wars between Christians and Muslims because, sacred land. This part is our sacred land, but then everyone thinks of that. So, in all, there were eight major crusade expeditions, both like varying in like size and degree and success, between this time. So, the costly, violent, and often ruthless conflicts enhanced the status of European Christians and made them major players in the fight for land in the Middle East. Okay, next is the Columbian Exchange. We just talked about this, and as you can see in the little chart, what else comes at the end? Disease. So the one, of course, the most prominent one that you should probably remember is smallpox. Slaves don't come in until a bit later when we get to the triangular trade. Right now, we're just talking about like the early trade of like goods. So Christopher Columbus, he found well, he supposedly found the New World. Some people say that, he didn't. I think he didn't, but whatever. Um, they introduced like horses, sugar plants, and of course, new diseases to the New World. They also got more stuff from the New World to the Old World, like tobacco, chocolate, and potatoes and turkey, apparently. So another thing about maritime developments is that silver is very important, and we will find out that in a bit because silver plays a big role in trade. So, um, the thing about the Columbian exchange is essentially it connects the New World and the Old World, right? So, the prosperity of Europe, um, they played a major role. Spain had a lot of like silver over there, and eventually it contributed to Spain's decline because of some kind of inflation and fighting a bunch of wars that they couldn't pay off their debts. A bunch of animals, right? New World and Old World, they don't have like the same animals. They can swap and find new stuff. Crops. Okay. Do you guys know what they come over here to America to plant certain crops to make money? What are these crops called? Right, cash crops. Why do they call them cash crops? Because they make them money. Anyways, um these cash crops would later, make the development of like plantations in America. And of course, we will eventually talk about like slave trade and such. Basically, the New World became the new wallet of Europeans because wow, we have so much we can do here. That's basically free money. So that's a development we will go over in a bit. And because of the disease that was transported also over to the New World, a lot of indigenous people in America died because they were never exposed to disease and they just didn't have any immunity against it, as opposed to the Europeans who had been, living with a bunch of people with smallpox, and it's basically just a common cold for them. And the Native Americans, they weren't so lucky. Um, there were many cases where like disease killed a lot of people. Yeah. Um, Also, deforestation happened. This is less important as compared to the other ones. Um, I don't know what conversation you guys are having in the chat, but I'm gonna guys, let's not talk about racism. We'll talk about that when we get to Unit 9 and like reforms, but yeah. Anyways, the society of the New World will soon also be changed because, the Europeans come here and they want to implement their stuff here. Native Americans, they're not strong enough to stop it. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Um, Empires. So, um, these three over here, the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal Empire. These are the gunpowder empires. We won't cover a lot of them, but just mostly remember what these are. The Russian Empire and European ones are more likely to be SAQ. Likely you might be asked about their leaders. Can someone name me like a Russian Empire emperor or leader? Yeah, Ivan, Peter. Hmm. You guys may be asked on an SAQ about, for example, what did this leader do? Is what did this leader do about his like religion? How did he use religion to expand his power? Or maybe like in Europe, how did this monarchy came to be? That's not because we just don't have enough like um it's not broad enough of a topic to be like really discussed on a major essay. For like LEQs though, they might talk about like how certain of these empires like expanded that. I think I ran into that one on my test. I didn't choose it because I really didn't want to write about this. Um, so yeah, the empires you just gotta remember these three had gunpowder. They were also the Ottoman and Safavid were often in religious conflict. That might be a useful tip to be for MCQs, they might, give you a stimulus of a cartoon of an Ottoman and Safavid fighting, like having a war, and they'll ask, "Oh yeah, what led to this depiction?" Right? It's because of religion, the Muslims, Sunni and Shia, right? Bunch of religious conflict. Mughal Empire, I think there were a few. I think there were a few leaders over there that were you can like talk about like Akbar the Great. I think he was very religiously tolerant. I still remember him to this day because he did help me out on the SAQ. The Manchu Qing Empire, that one, I don't know. That one just has like less than the other ones. I think mostly they would talk about the gunpowder ones or Russia. Anyways, I'm gonna move on to the next one. The Magna Carta. This one, I don't think a lot of teachers teach this in class, but this was issued in 1215. Basically, it was like the first document to say, oh yeah, the king cannot be a tyrant. You can't just do whatever you want to. So of course, you know, this was only put into effect after a king was like forced to sign it. So um, basically, it sought to basically prevent a king from like doing whatever he wants, placed limits on them, and made sure law was above the king. Um, this one you might use as a context. Maybe you can say that this was like the beginning, like the very ancestor of Enlightenment ideas, right? Like social contract stuff like that. But yeah, this one I wouldn't say they would not ask a whole essay question on this one. Nor would they ever do an SAQ on this. Most likely, you mostly like would you probably use this as a context. It might be gone over on the MCQ, but I doubt it. Anyway, this is just something you should know very early on. Don't say that it happened during the Enlightenment, even though the ideas were similar. It did not happen during the Enlightenment period. 1215, that does not sound like the 1500s. Anyways, after that, we have the Renaissance, the 15th and 16th century. Once again, this one, it has a lot of historical impact, right? It has a lot of historical impact. It was a very big movement. It's his cultural movement. It was like Middle Ages to modernity, a very big transition, characterized by an effort to revive and surpass the ideas and achievements of classical antiquity. It began in the Republic of Florence and then spread to the rest of Italy and then throughout Europe. I doubt that they'll ask you where it actually started, but could be something nice you could remember. The intellectual basis of the Renaissance was its version of humanism. It was derived from the concept of Roman humanitas and the rediscovery of classical Greek philosophy. Prominent figures, excuse me, For example, we would talk maybe about Francis Bacon, who was a statesman and philosopher, considered the master of the English tongue. I don't think a lot of this will be gone over, but you should definitely remember the Renaissance is a great period of like literature and like arts and stuff. William Shakespeare was alive. He was doing his stuff in this period, right? You guys know Shakespeare, right? I mean, surely. Have you in English class you would definitely have like read over one of or many of his works. Galileo, he was also in this time. You guys know Galileo, right? He physician, astronomist, mathematician. Christopher Columbus, also here. Ferdinand Magellan, he was also exploring here. Yeah. Anyway, just a transition period. Um, Galileo, yes, he would be more scientific revolution. However, he was also, around this era. He helped disprove a lot of medieval thinking in science. So, you could say I think he would be more in scientific revolution, but he was also part of the Renaissance, I would say. And that's great because we get to talk about the scientific revolution right after. So, the scientific revolution, it's basically the period of drastic change in science throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. It basically, because like the dominant view of nature was the Greek view, and that had dominated science for like 2000 something years. And the scientific revolution basically just replaced that. It emphasized on abstract reasoning, quantitative thought, understanding how nature works, the view of nature as a machine, and etc. Um, it led to the emergence of new information during the scientific revolution. It called into question the religious beliefs, moral principles, and traditional scheme of nature. It also strained old institutions and practices. They talked about new ways of communicating and information. For example, certain prominent innovations included scientific societies, scientific papers, right? They started writing papers. Like recently in the modern era, people write papers and they win Nobel Prizes. I'm sure you guys have heard about like people who've won Nobel Prizes because of like papers they wrote. I think that like started around here. And later, the scientific revolution also connected to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, I'm sure everyone knows because it has basically its own unit. Like the scientific revolution, it also began in Europe. It took place during the 17th and 18th centuries. We will get to Enlightenment in a bit. I'm just going to give like a little preview. Um, Basically, it synthesized ideas concerning God, reason, nature, and humanity into a worldview that celebrated reason. So, for example, if your king is taxing you too much, you were asked to question why should he do that, right? Basically, the Enlightenment later led to a series of revolutions. Can you guys name me a few revolutions that it led to? And don't say the most popular one. Don't say the most popular one. Yeah, French Revolution, Latin American, Asian, American Revolution. Yes, of course, the most. Okay, let's move on to the Enlightenment then. So the Enlightenment, I would say this one is super, super important to remember, especially for FRQs. I think this one has a lot of impact on FRQs because this time they have, especially the Enlightenment, right? Because people were writing stuff. You guys know, do you guys know Thomas Paine? What did Thomas Paine write for America? Do you guys know who Thomas Paine is? Yes. Common sense, right? Common sense sounds like a very funny name, right? Ah, it's common sense. But it was I mean it is pretty funny, but anyway, it was basically calling out the American people, right? Why are you guys still staying down? Revolt. Yeah, revolt. The Age of Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason and Enlightenment, which is like the same thing except one more word. It was the intellectual and philosophical movement that occurred in Europe in this time period. So, once again, the time periods is something you should remember. Um, the time period because it's important to know what comes before something. you can't say that the Enlightenment occurred before the scientific revolution, right? That doesn't make sense. And if you try to write that, your context point would be gone. But I assume that you guys would know that it is after. Anyways, the Enlightenment featured a range of social ideas centered on the value of knowledge earned by the way of rationalism and empiricism on political ideas such as natural law, liberty, progress, blah, blah, blah. Stuff like the social contract, right? Social contract, things like that, natural rights, basically told people that, yeah, you can do what you want to. Um, you don't have to be controlled by the government who oppresses you, right? If the government taxes you too much, you can revolt, things like that. Um, and basically, the Enlightenment, it was preceded by the scientific revolution, and there are certain people over here that you guys might want to remember. For example, John Locke, who had the social contract, Thomas Hobbes, um, Voltaire, Adam Smith. Do you guys know what Adam Smith, what was his Enlightenment thing? What was his thing? What did Adam Smith talk about? Oh, maybe I was thinking about wrong person. I was trying. I think I was thinking about John Adams. Wait, no, James Adams. Whatever. I think I was thinking about the laissez-faire guy. But anyways, these people are nice to remember. Mary Wollstonecraft. She was not talked about at all. I think. Well, I mean, I not talked about at all is a bit of a stretch. But Mary Wollstonecraft. She is less talked about as an Enlightenment thinker, but more so talked about as a feminist advocate. She's like one of the first ones. You can definitely use her as a context if you ever get an SAQ about Unit 9, right? Unit 9, if you need to talk about the feminist movement and like women rights, you can cite Mary Wollstonecraft as like a context, right? Back in the Enlightenment, Mary Wollstonecraft has been advocating for this, etc. Um, So the ideas of the Enlightenment basically undermined the authority of monarchy and religious officials, right? So this was a very bad thing for Europe because European European monarchies they were overthrown a lot. French, right? French and English, right? Britain got revolted against by America. So of yeah, a bunch of 19th century movements, including liberalism, socialism, neoclassicism, they all, come from the Enlightenment. Many consider it to be a major turning point in Western civilization, age of, light, replacing an age of darkness, hence the name, the Enlightenment. It's like shining light. People now get to think for themselves. The central doctrines of the Enlightenment were individual liberty and religious tolerance, opposing the absolute monarchy and like power of religious authorities that were there before. It was marked by an increasing awareness of the relationship between the mind and everyday media of the world, and by an emphasis on the scientific method and reductionism, along with increased questioning of religion, religious orthodoxy. So the Enlightenment did, and then lead to a lot of revolutions, which we will talk about in a bit, because the revolutions are super important. Very well, not very, but just very pretty FRQ like likely. So yeah. So the Industrial Revolution. There are two industrial revolutions, as you guys may know. Who can tell me the difference between the two industrial revolutions? Right. Okay. The Industrial Revolution was the transition from, creating goods by hands to using machines, right? So there are things like the loom, the power loom. Um, its start and end are very debated by people, but The period was around this time, well, no, probably later in the 1700s to like mid 1800s. That was the first one. The first industrial revolution was like we worked on textiles, steam power, and iron. And then in the 18th and early 19th centuries, that was the first one. The second one was more about steel, chemicals, and like different types of energy, like electronics, um, precision machinery. It was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So, according to some, this turning point in history is responsible for an increase in population. Urbanization occurred in this era as well, an increase in the standard of living, and the emergence of the capitalist economy, right? So, because of the advancements in technology, people get to live better lives. And then also people start working in the factories, right? What do you guys know about the factory workers, right? Wage laborers. There's also like child labor going around and a lot of that stuff. Now, I think that's like likely to be asked on a FRQ possibly about the impacts of industrialization. Um, the Industrial Revolution is often divided into the first and second one. Um, it was a period of global transition of the human economy toward more widespread, efficient, and stable manufacturing process that succeeded the agricultural revolution. So, the Industrial Revolution, does anyone know where it began? Oh, shoot. One sec. I mean, I think I wrote it on there, but if you guys could like close your eyes and type it on there. Anyways. Yeah, guys, stop talking about how geeked Edward is. That's not part of AP World History. If Edward makes it famous, we can talk about it when he gets added to the curriculum. Anyways, so output greatly increased, right? Because of what? Because of factory systems. Um, so the result then was an unprecedented rise in population and the rate of population growth. The textile industry was the first to use modern production methods, and textile became the dominant industry in terms of employment, value of output, and capital invested. So that's the Industrial Revolution. Mostly, I think you would. mm, there's also like railroads. I think that was an important part because I remember I wrote on my exam of my LEQ, I chose the Industrial Revolution one, and I wrote about like t telegram and like railroads and steam-powered engines and how that facilitated communication and things like that. Um, so the thing about you can also remember the Transcontinental Railroad, right? Um, that's also a main thing. They built a bunch of transportation. Quantity of like really like increased because of more efficiency, but then again like labor issues became a thing. I think if you guys will tune into the APUS class there, I think Edward will talk about mm, mm, the labor issues and like union strikes and stuff. um Revolution, right, caused mostly good things, I would say, for like the nation, for nations, for economies, for the people. Standard of life did increase. There were factory workers, but yeah. So you just need to understand that the Industrial Revolution left a very big impact on the society of these nations that were impacted by it. Of course, every nation eventually did industrialize. It was just a matter of, who went first and who did it faster. Okay, next are the revolutions. These are very, very, very important because they have a very big chunk on the AP test. So, new shifts in ideology emphasizing reason, which is the Enlightenment, emphasizing reason over tradition and individualism over community values. Basically, the Enlightenment told these uh, people who are oppressed or want to like revolt against their rule to well cause revolutions. These are the main ones that are went over on the AP World History curriculum. The American one, of course, Latin American ones, Haitian and French. So I think the two most popular ones that students often remember the most about, of course, first of all, is the American Revolution because people just that's like the I feel like that's the easiest to know because we've been taught this for a long time. And then the second one would be French. So the Haitian also, I guess, they liberated themselves from slavery. Anyways, the revolutions sort of happened because of the scientific revolution, humanism, Renaissance, and mostly Enlightenment. And the impact of them was the clash of like new and old ideas led to revolutions and in thought and the revolutions themselves. So revolutions, of course, don't just occur as like a form of rising up and fighting back. There was also revolutions in thought because we still call the Enlightenment technically a revolution and like the scientific revolution a revolution, right? Revolutions in thought. Um, so importantly, there are a few isms like abolo frick ab abolitionism to end slave trade. That was very big in, well, I guess that was pretty big in America later on, but like in the Haitian Revolution, right? Um, I think this might have been gone over from by your teachers, but the Haitian Revolution was the first, I think, and only successful nation to self-liberate themselves from like servitude and slavery. There's also capitalism. You guys know what capitalism is. And there was also these all came from Enlightenment ideas and like the thought revolutions, not like the actual revolutions in which they overthrow a government and execute their leader, which happened in France. Nationalism happened here, socialism. There was feminism occurred from the thought revolutions. You know, people started actually thinking about how they wanted to go about things. So now let's actually get into the real topic of these revolutions. North American Revolution, I would think you guys would know a lot about that. Declaration of Independence, right? Using uh, John Locke's ideas, things like Thomas Paine's common sense, right? No taxation without representation, things like that. These revolutions might be asked on the LEQ. It's very likely for this time period. And I would say if you are asked to compare and contrast the go-to, you would probably compare the American one because I was assume that most people know the most about that in either French or Haiti. Okay, the Latin American revolutions, there were actually a few. For example, in South America, there was the Creole Revolution with Simon Bolivar, his the Jamaica letters, etc. Basically, the Creoles, those who are born of European ancestry in America, they had economic, political, and ideological tensions with Spanish rule, and various revolutions occurred, many in South America, leading to independence in areas that became Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. There was also the revolutions in Caribbean, which is there were the Haitian Revolution, which the uprising of slaves and escaped slaves against their masters and the revolution for independence from France. Um, yeah, so once again, it's something you might want to write about for if you write about the Haitian Revolution is that they are the first and only nation to self-liberate from an enslaved state. Basically, their leader was influenced by the Enlightenment, advocated ethnic tolerance, and opposed racial discrimination. Okay, now in the European revolutions, of course, it was just France. Declaration of the Right of Man and the Citizen. That was like, I think that was inspired off of the Declaration of Independence. They established the first French Republic in 1792. And then guess who came and became Emperor of France in 1804? What happened? Who came in? Yeah, that's exactly right. Napoleon took over, and then in a few year, in about like a decade or so, he is defeated. And Napoleon is pretty important. You can he you can think about Napoleon's conquest, I don't they won't talk about Napoleon's conquest a lot here, but you need to know that he basically um, the French got their revolution, and then Napoleon basically like came in and became emperor. So that's great. That's great. Okay. Next is the Seven Years' War. Now, this one is both very important in AP World History and especially in AP US history because this one is um, it's like the result of it caused basically I would say indirectly caused the revolution of America, right? Can anyone tell me why? Why was the Seven Years' War important to America? Right. Britain got poor. They fought a war that they could hardly afford, right? They didn't have money. So you need to understand something, right? The thing wasn't just taxes. Of course, it was mainly taxes, right? The British taxed America to pay off their war debts. But um, the thing also is that you know the phrase "no taxation without representation," right? Because Americans who were in the 13 colonies, of course, they weren't America yet, they were the 13 colonies of America. They believed that they were British citizens. They were part of Great Britain. However, of course, the colonies of America were not granted like any representation in British courts. They were just colonies and did not have, representation. So, well, if you don't represent us, you don't get to tax us. That's the essential argument for no taxation without representation, as it says, right? So, okay, anyways, the Seven Years' War, very it's a global conflict involving the European powers, mostly just Britain and France, and I guess America helped out as well. Um, it's the main part of it. You use it as context for the taxation and like the revolution of like America, stuff like that. Um, this one maybe you would see it on MCQs. I highly doubt it would be actually on the FRQ unless it's like talking about Enlightenment ideals. Um, yeah. Okay, wait, before that, I also have another one that I didn't add on the sides. The Meiji Restoration. Yes, this also occurred in 1868. Basically, this would set like a context for like later stuff to do with Japan. Um, because before that, right? What do you guys know about the Perry expedition? Do you guys know about the Perry expedition? Okay. It's okay. You guys won't have be exactly test on it, but it is important because what the Japanese policy before the Perry expedition was isolationism, right? They didn't want to trade. However, the Perry expedition, also known as the arrival of the Black Ships, it was a diplomatic and military expedition in two separate voyages, like to the Tokugawa shogunate by warships of the United States Navy. To do what? To the goal was to explore, survey, and establish diplomatic relations, and especially to negotiate trade agreements with various nations of the region, and probably especially Japan. Opening contact with the government of Japan was considered a top priority of the expedition and was one of the key reasons for its inception. So Japan didn't want to do anything with the outside world, right? They were closed off. But then the gunships came and it was like, yeah, no, open up and trade with us. Um, the expedition was commanded by Commodore Perry under orders of President Millard Fillmore. Perry's primary goal was to force an end to Japan's 220-year-old policy of isolation and to open their ports to American trade. So it basically led directly to establishments of diplomatic relations, whether they liked it or not. Japan had to trade with the Western great powers, And eventually, the Tokugawa shogunate collapsed, and they restored the empire. Following the expedition, Japan started like doing a lot of trade, and it basically is, well, of course, once again in trade, you don't just trade goods, right? You also trade culture and ideas and stuff like that. Thankfully, there weren't they did not trade a lot of diseases I mean, they probably did, but like it didn't cause a pandemic. Nothing like the Black Death or the smallpox issue in America happened. Um, yeah, and the Meiji Restoration, we'll just go over this really quick. In 1868, the Tokugawa shogunate, who ruled Japan, basically lost his power, and the emperor was restored. And then the emperor took the name Meiji, which means enlightened rule. And then this period was the Meiji Restoration, right? Because, restoring the Meiji. Makes sense. Okay, another one before we go on is the Treaty of Nanjing on August 29th, 1842, the treaty that ended the First Opium War. So what do you guys know about the Opium Wars? What do you guys know about the Opium Wars? Uh, this is commonly talked about. Yeah. Well, yeah, mostly Britain. It was also a few other because like every European country also wanted a piece of that. Right. Can you guys wait? Yeah, I know Britain versus China, right? But can you guys tell me? Yeah, okay, thank you. That answered my question, right? So Britain wanted to trade with China, but the problem was that China had all the good stuff. Britain didn't have like any of the good stuff that they actually wanted. So what do? They make a good that China needs from them so that they can trade again. So they had opium, and basically opium became like something that China needed because of drug addiction, and it was like really bad. People got super addicted. Even though a bunch of people were saying it was like the elixir of life and how it can make you feel young, but it was just drugs. Anyways, of course, China did realize that this isn't good, so they fought opium wars to basically end opium trade, and yeah. The Treaty of Nanjing is the treaty that ended the First Opium War, and so basically, the China paid the British and money and ceded the territory of Hong Kong, and it agreed to establish a fair and reasonable tariff, but fair and reasonable in quotes. British merchants who previously were allowed to trade only at Guangzhou were now permitted to trade at five treaty ports, which are they're basically like places that they're allowed to trade. Um, The treaty was supplemented in 1843 by the British Supplementary Treaty of the Bogue, which basically allowed British citizens to be tried in British courts and granted Britain any rights in China that China might be granted to other countries. Right. So, Opium War overall, huge negative impact on China, right? Because like drug addiction, that's just not good for yeah, no, sorry. This one doesn't have the Treaty of Nanjing doesn't have a slide, so yeah. I just needed to mention that one. So yeah, and that is like as we are basically that's where we leave off for today, and we will go for more stuff anyway. About the Opium War, that's not going to be huge, I don't think, but it might be on the SAQ, they will talk about like, especially the thing about like history, right? The older things are, the less like documents you can actually find of them. Of course, there are things that are really well preserved, but modern things are even more well preserved. For example, like if you had a DBQ about the Cold War, you might have better preserved documents about that versus maybe something about Mongolian trade and stuff, you may have less options on that one. Anyway, about the Opium Wars, British versus China, right? More trade, um, albeit like it's kind of like forced trade, although not in like the Japanese way that they opened Japan. It's more like creating trade. Yeah. Okay. Right on time. That's very good. That's very, very good. So that is all for today. We will continue with the rest of the content. We'll go into like more recent times, right, following the Industrial Revolution, World Wars, Cold War, and of course Unit 9, which has not a lot of stuff. But yeah, okay, that is the end for today's lecture. Thank you all for attending. We will continue where we left off. Okay.